All right, well, I suppose we might as well get started, and if more people want to join us later, they are welcome to do that. So we'll just start off. Sorry about the late start, but we'll get going. So first of all, I want to start out by introducing myself. My name is Emma Lashley. I am an assistant librarian here at the Crawfordsville Public Library. And the reason that I'm giving this talk here is that my passion is archaeology. I recently graduated from Purdue with a degree in anthropology with a focus in archaeology. That's the main way people in the United States study archaeology is via anthropology. It's one of the 4 subdisciplines of anthropology. And then I also got a degree in classical studies with a focus in archaeology. And classical studies is specifically the study of ancient Greece and Rome. So it's a slightly different route into archaeology, but I wanted to cover all my bases there. And I'm currently in the process of applying to a handful of archaeology master's programs. Over here on the right is a picture of me at one of the digs that I've worked on in Ireland. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you guys, since it is Indiana Archaeology Month. I wanted to talk about a couple of the questions that I get asked all of the time when I mention that I'm an archaeologist or that I study archaeology, especially here at the library. People always have questions for me when I say that this is what I'm interested in doing and that this is what I study. So these are the main 8 questions that we're going to talk about today, and we'll go into all of them in a little bit of detail in a second. But I also wanted to say, originally this was supposed to be an in-person event, so I wanted it to be very interactive. I wanted people to be able to ask me questions and for us to have a conversation. And unfortunately, 2021, COVID issues. So what I'd like to say is just at any point during this presentation, if you have a question that you think of that you want to ask me or that you have about archaeology, just go ahead and throw it in the comments because there is a little bit of lag here with Facebook. So just at any point that you have one, throw it in the chat, and then at the end I will go through those questions and we can talk about them together. So right off the bat, always got to start at the beginning. What is archaeology? And probably my favorite definition is just the Wikipedia definition. I think they boil it down really well. Archaeology is the study of human activity through the recovery and analysis of material culture. And basically that really sums it up. It's studying the history of humans through the things they left behind. And we'll dig into this definition a little more as we go, but I did want to highlight a couple parts, including the fact that it is the study of human activity. You guys would not believe the number of times that I have been asked questions about dinosaurs. I do not research dinosaurs, I research people. Archaeology is people, paleontology is dinosaurs. There's very, very little overlap. Probably the only overlap is we use some of the same tools when we're digging. That's really about it. There's a 65 million year gap between the last dinosaur and the first modern human, so there really isn't any kind of overlap in what we study. So unfortunately, if you have questions about dinosaurs, I'm not going to be much help. I think they're cool, maybe we can geek out about them, but I'm not trained in that. So human activity through the recovery of material culture. So that might lead you to ask, what is material culture? Or at least it gives me the excuse to describe it. And really the things that archaeologists study in the field boils down to 3 separate things: artifacts, features, and ecofacts. Artifacts are probably what you think about an archaeologist looking for. They're objects made and modified or used by humans. So your stereotypical, your spear points, your pottery, anything that humans are making is going to be an artifact. But then you also have features, and these are considered non-portable artifacts. So these include anything like soil stains, parts of buildings, structures, anything like that. Soil stains is probably the most common. You can see a picture of that over here on the right. You can see how the soil in that picture is a little darker. That probably was a storage pit where organic materials were. So when they broke down, they become a darker color than the soil around them. That's a feature. It tells us a lot, even though it's just a change in the color of the soil and not something that you could take home and put in a museum. Then the third thing is ecofacts. And ecofacts are natural remains related to human activity. So not necessarily artifacts, but things that a human interacted with or that would affect their environment. Usually this means plant and animal remains. Very helpful in telling you what people were eating. Shells as well, like shell middens, a pile of shells that people have been eating, that sort of thing. And it is a very fine line because say you have a pig bone and someone ate the meat off the pig bone and dumped it in the trash. That would really be an eco-fact. But say someone took that pig bone and they carved it and they made it into a comb, like the one you see with those 3 artifacts on top of in this picture here. Well, then it becomes an artifact. So it is kind of a fine line between an eco-fact and an artifact. But basically, every thing that an archaeologist is looking at in the field is going to break down into one of these 3 terms. And so I wanted to start right off the bat and explain what actually happens at a dig. I think this is a question probably a lot of people have, but maybe they don't know why to ask me. So maybe it's something I wish people would ask me. So I wanted to break down the process of archaeology, and it's a lot like the scientific method. You have a set of steps that you have to do every time you're doing archaeology. So it starts with hypothesis creation. It's very important to know, I think, that everyone knows that archaeologists, they're not just going out and digging randomly looking for artifacts or going treasure hunting. What we see Indiana Jones do in the movie is absolutely not what real archaeologists do. He's a cool guy, I love the movies, but he's very bad at his job. He's a very bad archaeologist. Archaeological excavations are very, very carefully done to discover the answer to very specific research questions. And in fact, the goal is to dig as little as possible. We have this concept that you can only dig something once, and the idea that technology will always become better. So someone who was digging back in the 1920s wouldn't learn as much from a site as we learn today, because obviously we have new tools like carbon dating and things like that. And so we believe that the same thing is going to happen in the future. You know, in 100, 200 years from now, archaeologists will be able to find out so much more from a site. So it's important that we don't dig everything, because you can only do that once, and we want them to have something in the future too where they can learn more. The only exception to this rule is something called cultural resource management archaeology, and we'll go into this a little more in a bit, but usually this is done when a site is going to be completely destroyed, usually by some sort of construction. So in that case, you just have to get whatever data you can from what's there, because it will be destroyed no matter what. So once you know that you have a research question and a general area you want to look in, you have to get the very specific site that you're going to dig in, figure it out. And there's lots of ways you can do this, that you can help find the best spot, because obviously you don't know what's under the ground until you start digging, but there's a lot of ways you can kind of figure that out ahead of time. Evidence, artifact location by asking the community. You know, people will tell you, oh yeah, back in the day my dad found blah, 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 blah when he was putting in our garden. Information like that. People in the community will kind of have an idea of what's going on underneath the ground. Very similarly, you always want to ask about local myths, legends, and stories. A lot of information is passed down in communities that don't even realize it. So, you know, some story about, I don't know, a ghost or a castle that used to be somewhere might have more truth to it than you think. Something very important and very helpful is if you can get a historical reference or an old map. You know, if somebody wrote in their diary about, you know, this building that used to be there, or you can find an old map. That is kind of best case scenarios if you're working in a historic period where that's possible. Satellite and aerial photography is very cool, definitely a newer thing in archaeology relatively. A lot of sites around here are found this way, especially when there's a drought. The vegetation will get a little browner if there's something under the ground a lot of times, and that's actually how they found Fort Wiatnan up in West Lafayette. They were flying a plane over during a drought, and they were able to see the outline of the fort and figure out what was there, which is pretty cool. We also have very, very high-tech methods now, like subsurface detection. These include ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry. We'll talk about them more later, but basically high-tech tools that let you get an idea of what's under the ground before you even dig. And then most of the time, archaeologists will also do a surface survey. This is where you take hours or days, depending on the size of the area, and you really in-depth examine the terrain of the area you're looking at. See if you think some things are man-made, if this could be a hill that was made artificially, that sort of thing. And you're also looking for small artifacts on the surface of the ground, things above ground. And you mark those very carefully on a map, and sometimes you notice a hot spot there, and that can be very helpful in telling you that that was an area that was frequented very often, so likely there's something under the ground there. Then you get to the part that everyone's probably thinking about, the excavation. And this process is very much like a detective at a crime scene. Archaeologists evaluate and record everything with great precision because you want to preserve the context of everything you find for the future. A big part of how you do that is you divide a site into sections to help you keep track of the location of everything you find on your big site plan, your big fancy map. So over here on the right, you can see in the top picture, they've got these twine set up so you get these squares, and that way you know exactly what square and where within that square everything you find comes from. And you're not just recording the coordinates on the ground, you're also recording the vertical, the depth where you find everything, because the horizontal is also very important. Usually archaeologists pay a lot of attention to the layers in the soil for this reason, called strata, and these help you date and compare artifacts, because generally, unless something crazy has happened, older artifacts are always going to be underneath newer ones, so you can figure out the date of a lot of things by working backwards like that. So the depth is just as important as figuring out where it was horizontally. So while you're doing that, while you're excavating, data collection and recording is incredibly important. Before things are removed from the ground, before artifacts, ecofacts, whatever are removed from the ground, you have to get photographs, drawings, detailed notes, all kind of information about them and their surroundings, because you need to know the context where it was found, what color the soil is, that sort of thing. With that in mind, archaeologists are trained to notice changes in soil texture, color, density, and even smell. I'm sure there's some archaeologists out there that would tell you taste as well, but I don't know if I would believe them. And then you draw and record this on a top plan so that you notice all of those changes in soil. You can see an example of this over here on the right, that top picture there. If you can see there's little letters written on each little section. It's like C261. Those are all different types of soil that archaeologist is recording at that level. So then they might dig another, 2 or 3 centimeters down and then do a plan again so you can see the change in soil as you dig deeper and deeper into the ground, and also figure out which soil level each artifact came from. Everything that you find, every artifact, is going to be photographed multiple times. So you're going to photograph it when you first notice it emerging from the ground, after it's been completely uncovered but is still in situ, still in the place where it originally was, and after it has been removed, cleaned, and recorded, and that happens in the next step. The dirt from a specific spot is generally removed and sieved, especially if it seems likely that there might be a small find in there that may have been missed. The sieved items are recorded in those squares I was talking about, so you take all the dirt from one square, sieve it. Anything small that you missed when you're excavating the first time will be recorded as part of that square, because obviously you don't know where exactly it came from, but that's going to be really small things like beads and seeds and things that you might not see when you're actively excavating. The pictures on the bottom over here on the right of the two is an example of one of these photographs. So this is when it's still in situ, it's still in the ground, but it's been kind of cleaned up as much as possible without removing it. The little white arrow is always pointing north in these pictures, so you understand how it's laid out relative to the overall excavation, and the little black and white thing is for length, so you can see the relative size of it. Then on the left picture there on the bottom is a system we used at my site in Ireland that is similar to sieving, but it's specifically looking for biological objects. So it's kind of more of you add water to the soil, and the seeds and things you're looking for will float in this system. So the next step is the laboratory and conservation step. So once an artifact has been removed from the ground, they're immediately taken to a lab that's generally set up nearby the site where you're digging. And in that lab, objects are further cleaned, stabilized, and conserved. So you want to make sure that they're going to last for the long haul and store them in the best possible way. At this point, also, the very thorough records are made for each object. Usually when it's raining and pouring and gross and hot out in the field, you don't have time to sit there for every object you find and write down all the measurements and things. So that's why you send them to the lab and they take care of that. And they put it into generally a computer system so that all that information will be very useful for research later. At this point, that last photograph, once it's completely clean, will be taken, and detailed drawings are usually made, especially with your nicer, more interesting pieces, because sometimes cameras just don't pick up on some of the more intricate details, so you want to make sure you get as many good images as possible of these things. A lot of labs will have a conservator, which is someone who is specially trained to preserve and restore delicate or damaged objects, because you really don't want to find some really intricate gold piece or something, and then once it's out of the ground, you damage it more than it already was. So usually there's someone there who is very well trained to take care of that. And the last step of this is all the artifacts are carefully packaged up and stored. Usually they're taken to the museum or university that the dig is associated with, and that way they're kept safe for the future and for any further research that the archaeologists want to do. The second to last step is interpretation, and this is when all of the archaeologists working on a site kind of come together and they're responsible for interpreting what they found. So it's all great to say, we found 400 pieces of this type of pottery here. All right, what does that mean? What do you think that means? As the person who looked at the site for 3 months straight, what was it telling you during this process? So this is really where you put your own spin on what happens, and you have to remember this is only one possible version of site's history. Obviously, every excavation is going to have its own bias. So that's also why you do such a good job of recording all the evidence, because you want other people to be able to look at this in the future too. And it's very important to remember when you're the archaeologist doing that all of this information is incomplete. Many things are destroyed over time, and many objects will just never be found. So sometimes you're looking as much as what isn't there as what is, and that can tell you a lot as well. So this is kind of the theory, the interpretation stage. And lastly, you have to publish everything that you've done. So the end result of every excavation should be publication. You want to publish just the raw data of all of your finds, all of your plans, all of your photography, all of that, as well as with your interpretation. And ideally, this publication will be thorough enough that other archaeologists and historians can look at that data for themselves and either say, oh, I agree with what you've said in your theory, or I disagree, or they can even take that data and do something new with it. It's also very important, like I said, we don't know what archaeologists are going to be looking at in 100 or 200 years, so we want to make sure that that data is available for them as well, because they might want to investigate the same site or a similar site in the future and want to be able to access all of that information now. So once again, you can only do it once, so once you've done it, you need to make sure that that data is there for people in the future. Alright, so the next thing is, what tools do archaeologists use? Kind of the same vein. It's actually, for once, very much what you think it is. So there's really two sets. There's the basic tools and the high-tech tools. The basic tools are, like I said, exactly what you're expecting. It's a shovel, it's a trowel, it's a mattock, which is a lot like a pickaxe. We use a lot of brooms and brushes that you sweep into a little dustpan and then dump in a bucket. You take that bucket, you carry it away, you dump it in, you either sieve that in your sieve and then dump it in your, wherever you're putting your excess dirt. And then we have all kinds of tools that we use to very carefully clean things in the field, and honestly they're very normal things that you could probably get at a Walmart. It's things like dental picks, toothbrushes, spoons, fine blades, just whatever you can use to very carefully clean something in the field. Measuring instruments, obviously very important. You need to take measurements on everything you do, so those are always in abundant supply. A lot of archaeologists will use earth movers, bulldozers, and backhoes, just to get rid of that top layer of soil where theoretically there aren't any artifacts, or where those artifacts would be out of context anyway because they've been brought up to the surface over time. That is, however, kind of controversial. A lot of archaeologists say if you have the time, you should do all that by hand so you don't miss anything there either. Then you have your high-tech tools, and this is where it gets pretty cool. Drones are really big right now, definitely a very new tool to the arsenal, but they're really great for taking those aerial pictures we were talking about earlier, but they can also be used to take measurements of different things while you're excavating. Especially they can use LiDAR to measure the terrain, which is really cool, so you get a really accurate map of your area. Then you have magnetometers, and these measure the magnetic field in the earth and provide an idea of what's underground. So like things like fire pits will show up, certain types of stone will show up, Different disturbances in the soil will show up. So you get a very interesting idea of where things are underground before you even start digging. Same thing with ground penetrating radar. It sends radar pulses into the ground and they bounce back up to the machine. That's the picture on the top, on the right over there, is a ground penetrating radar. And things with different densities under the ground and at different depths will bounce back differently. So boulder's going to look at same thing. Boulder's going to look different than gravel. So it helps you see what's going to be there before you even dig. And then one of my favorite tools is something called the total station. That's a picture of it there on the bottom, and you use that along with GPS to get really accurate measurements of where your artifacts are. So what you do is once you found an artifact and you've removed it from its location, you immediately put a little pole in the ground, a specially designed pole with a little reflector on top on that spot. And the total station sends out a little laser beam. The laser beam hits that reflector, comes back to the total station, and the total station uses that data to exactly record the height and location of that artifact you found. And then it saves that information, and later you plug that into your computer and it puts all of your artifacts on this really detailed map. It's a very cool, very powerful tool that lets us be super accurate very quickly, which is cool. Lastly, once you've done that, something you use a lot is GIS, which stands for Geographic Information System. And this is a type of software that you put on your computer, and it helps you analyze all of that spatial data that you collected. It lets you create maps, it lets you play with spatial data, it lets you analyze spatial data. It's very, very helpful for this kind of research. So maybe a question that I wish people would ask me is, are there different types of archaeology and archaeologists? And the answer is absolutely yes, there is, but there's many, many different ways that you can break down and many different ways that an archaeologist can define themselves. So if you ever meet one in a conversation, they might call themselves a paleoarchaeologist or an osteologist. So this is kind of how that all works. First big way, and for a long time probably one of the most common ways, is by time. You have paleoarchaeology, which is archaeology that's happening before modern humans. So getting a little bit more into fossils and how humans evolved, that would be paleoarchaeology. Prehistoric archaeology is any archaeology before writing, and historic archaeology is any archaeology after writing. And that is going to change place to place because some cultures had writing a lot earlier than others. Some had writing a lot later. So place to place, that is going to change what those times are, but it's quite a common term used. And then a less common term is industrial archaeology. I actually had not run into this much until I was researching this, but it's any historic archaeology that is happening after the Industrial Revolution, which once again is a thing that kind of changes. Like the American Industrial Revolution obviously happened at a different time than the British Industrial Revolution, but it's kind of a new term for slightly more modern archaeology. Then another way that maybe much more traditionally archaeology can be broken down is by what culture or what area you're looking at. For example, I said I studied classical studies, and classical archaeologists will very commonly refer to themselves as classical archaeologists. This is maybe from an older time when archaeologists looked at very specific parts of the world more than others, but it's definitely a term that might be thrown around if you meet some archaeologists. Then a lot of archaeologists might break themselves down by specialty. So I want to go through a couple of maybe the most common and most interesting specialties that people might have. An osteoarchaeologist is someone who is expert on human bones and what they can tell us about a person's life. I tried to take a class on this. I thought it might be my interest area. These people are good at what they do. They can look at a tiny little sliver of bone and tell you so much about this person's life. It's crazy. So they're very good at what they do. Very similarly, you have archaeozoologists, and these people study animal remains in human settlements. So they can look at a tooth and tell you, oh, that's a pig, or that's a cow, or that's a sheep, which is more impressive than it sounds because sometimes the bones of those animals are very similar. So they can tell you all kinds of things about what people were eating. Same thing with archaeobotany. These people know a lot about plants and historic plants. So they look at the seeds and husks and things that people are leaving behind at their sites, and they can tell you all kinds of things about what these people were eating. Ethnoarchaeology is kind of a newer term, and that's when you try to study people who are alive today to better understand the lives of their ancestors. We had a couple cultural anthropologists along on our Ireland archaeology trip who were doing a bit of this, trying to, talk to people, be like, how do you do this farming technique, and seeing if that explains some of the things we were seeing in the archaeological record. I'm very interested in experimental archaeology, and this is where you try to reconstruct techniques and processes from the past to create your own artifacts, basically, and try to understand what you're finding. So if you find some object, you can't explain it, maybe you're trying to figure out what they were doing at the site and how they would have ended up creating this thing, or why they would have ended up creating this thing. It's pretty cool. And then lastly, I just want to talk about underwater archaeologists because they're cool. They do archaeology that's underwater, makes sense. Sometimes this is things like shipwrecks, and sometimes it's really old sites that are now underwater because sea levels have changed a lot over time. And they have kind of completely different methods sometimes because it's very hard to work when you're digging underground or underwater because dirt and things go everywhere. So it's a very, very interesting job that they have, and they have a lot of special training for that one. And there's many, many, many more ways to break these down like this, but these are just some that I like to talk about. Probably the last way that you might be able to break it down is most of what we've been talking about is academic archaeology, so archaeology done for universities and maybe museums, for research sake usually. There's also such a thing as cultural resource management archaeology, and mentioned a little bit earlier, it's when a site is going to be destroyed, usually by construction, sometimes by road building, that sort of thing, and so you have to figure out what was there as quickly as possible and get it recorded in the best detail you can before it gets destroyed anyway. So these usually work for some sort of firm, maybe a construction firm itself, or for the government, or through just a firm that focuses on this. But they're slightly different from academic archaeologists because they're not going in with a question in mind. They're going in to save as much data as they can. And this is a question I get all the time. Why do things become buried? And for a long time, I didn't know. No one in my archaeology classes ever really brought this up. So I had to do some of my own research because people kept asking me this. And there's 4 or 5 different reasons. Probably the biggest one is going to be nature. Plants are a big one. If a site is abandoned, plants will grow up quickly. The plants on top die off, become soil, new plants grow on top, they die off, become soil. Over time, that soil builds up and builds up and builds up, and will cover whatever's there. I was thinking about this, and a really good example is an unmaintained sidewalk. If you've ever been walking through an older town or a smaller town where they haven't been keeping up their sidewalks, you'll see how grass grows right over the top, and over time the sidewalk completely disappeared. It's like it was never even there. If you have an older house, you might have even noticed when there's a drought or something, an area may become browner in a certain square or a circle shape. That might have been an old patio or an old sidewalk, and that probably just got covered up over time. So that one's one you can kind of see a little bit in your everyday life even. Another big one is natural disaster. Usually floods, eruptions, and windstorms can all bring new soil to an area. And these are all more common in certain parts of the world. For example, a lot of sites in Greece are down in valleys that have been flooded over time. Olympia, where the Olympic Games were held, is a good example. It was in this valley, and it just every couple of years it would flood and bring more soil in, and things got covered up. Eruptions, obviously the big example, Pompeii. All of a sudden, volcano erupted, everything that's there gets covered. It's really well preserved for a long time. Yeah. And then windstorms, especially in places near a desert where there's lots of sand, strong winds can bring new sand to an area. That's why the Sphinx was covered up to its neck at one point, was just because a big sand dune had been pushed on top of it. So then the other reason is humans. A lot of times when we were building things, especially in older cities, a new house will just be built on top of the ruins of an old one. So it's very labor intensive to carry all your rubble away outside the city, so people would just tear their house down, spread out all the rubble, and then build their new house on top. So over time, the ground level of these cities just rose and rose and rose. But if you dig down each level, you can kind of figure out the foundations of what was there. The other thing is just survivorship bias. So humans can be kind of lazy, or, we always take the easiest route because we're smart. So if there's an abandoned building over here, and you can either take pre-quarried, pre-cut stones from that, or go and do all the effort of quarrying and cutting the stones yourself, you're obviously going to take the pre-made stones. So a lot of times, the best bits of any building are just going to get stolen and reused after it's been abandoned. And over time, whatever's left is just going to erode away by wind and rain. And so a lot of times the only thing that is left behind is the stuff that was underground. So the only thing you're going to find as an archaeologist is what you can dig down and get to. And lastly, things are purposely buried, which sounds a little crazy until you think about it. In our own culture, we bury our dead. A lot of cultures around the world do that. So if you're someone that's looking specifically at cemeteries and how people lived and how they died, you're going to have to dig. And a very small number of sites were purposely buried by the people who made them. You could kind of think like Valley of the Kings in Egypt. They didn't want those burials to be found, so they hid them. Also, Göbekli Tepe, which is one of my favorite sites, they believe parts of that were purposely filled in by the people that built it. So that does every once in a while happen as well. Oh, so then, hey, you ragged on Indiana Jones. What good archaeology media can we watch or read instead? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Okay, I don't actually hate Indiana Jones. I love those movies. They're really good. But if you want something that has slightly more accurate archaeology in it, I recently watched The Dig, and I thought it did a great job showing a famous archaeology find. I thought it was interesting, while they didn't over-dramatize the archaeology or do anything that I thought didn't make sense. They used a lot of the correct tools. Obviously, it's 1920s archaeology, so it's not exactly the same standards we're using today, but I think they did a great job of showing what the work of an archaeologist actually looks like, if slightly more dramatic. Fortunately, we can't get a copy of this here at the library. Netflix doesn't put their stuff out on DVD most of the time. We do, however, have the book, so you can always come in and read that. I also highly suggest Time Team. It's a British archaeology show where archaeologists go out and do weekend digs in real people's backyards. So people call them up, they say, hey, I found a bunch of Roman pottery in my backyard, could you see if there's something here? And they come in and they do 3 days of archaeology in a small area. They tell people what's actually in their backyard. It's way more interesting than it sounds, because sometimes they find really cool stuff, but it's also, they explain all of the science, all of the methods they're using. You see that sometimes you're not going to find gold and jewels and gems, but a mosaic floor might actually be way more interesting than that anyway. It's a great show. Highly recommend it. If you have internet at home, which you probably do because you're watching this, a lot of the episodes are available from Time Team themselves on YouTube for free. You can also stream them if you have Amazon Prime, and the library should be getting a couple of seasons on DVD here in the next month or two. Had to convince them. They're a little hard to find because they're British, so finding an American copy is pretty hard, but we did find a couple, and we're going to get them, so come look for those in the next couple months. Definitely, I'd say start with the newer ones. It was on for almost 20 years, so some of the older ones are very 80s and 90s camera quality, but the newer ones are very HD, very nice. And they're going to start a new season soon, so. And then when this was going to be in person, I was going to have a whole table of archaeology books that we have here at the library, but unfortunately couldn't do that. So I just wanted to let you all know that we do have a lot of great archaeology books here. Most of them are going to be in the 930.1s, 930.45 is kind of the ancient history type stuff. So come in and check those out if this interests you. If you're not sure where that is, just stop at our desk upstairs and someone will help you find those. Hopefully I'll be there and I can even give you recommendations. A couple more. The last three here are three I personally recommend. The Land of Open Graves is very intense, but it's probably my favorite archaeology book of all times. The Dig, obviously, I mentioned that the movie is very good, and that's a good one to check out. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the book that got me interested in archaeology in the first place, and that is the Elizabeth Peters series, the Amelia Peabody series. Crocodile on the Sandbank is the first one. If you're just looking for some Agatha Christie style murder mystery, but it's all Egyptian archaeology, check it out. It's great. So I have one more question that I'm going to answer here and then look through all of you guys' questions. So I just want to remind you, if you've thought of anything over this process that you want to ask about, go ahead and throw it in the chat so that I can find that. So the last question, how can I get involved in archaeology? If you're watching this and you're like, oh, I think archaeology is really cool, I want to do some of that in my life, how can you do that? well, I've broken it down by kind of how easy it is to get into. So right now, if you're stuck in your home, you're sitting on your couch, you're like, I want to do some archaeology. There's actually options for that. The first one is globalexplorer.org, and this lets you become a space archaeologist and help stop looting. It was created by a woman whose actual job title is space archaeologist, and she got a grant from TED Talk to create this website. So it's a very well-designed website. It runs like a video game. They train you how to spot looting from satellite images, and they turn it into a little video game, and you can level up, and it's actually really fun. And then if you level up enough while they're working on new projects, you can actually use your skills that you've learned from doing that to help find new archaeology sites. So they're actually finding new sites all the time with this website. It's very cool. I highly recommend you check it out. The other website you can check out from home is crowdsourced.micropasts.org, and this website lets archaeologists post projects that they need help completing. Usually it's things like transcribing notes or helping get artifact photos labeled correctly for publication. It's things that it would take them days and days and days to do if they were by themselves, but if you've got 100 people on the internet working on it, it's done in just a day or two. So it's helping with real archaeology, and it's getting stuff published more quickly, so it's a great site. And you never know what kind of tasks they're going to have. They can be very interesting. They're always looking for more people to do that, so highly recommend that one. And if you ever forget what these are or want to check them out, you can always send me an email. I'll have my email address at the end, and I can send them to you. Then locally, if you'd like to see what's happening kind of in the central Indiana area, I've got some suggestions for you. The reason I'm doing this month is because it is Indiana Archaeology Month, and they have a ton of great events going on, a ton of events done by people who know even more than I do, so I definitely recommend checking out all the things, probably like 30 or 40 different events they have going on over the month. It's quite impressive. And their website is on.in.gov/DHPA. That's the poster over there on the right. The theme this year is archaeology and the production of Hoosier spirits. So it's all about bottles, and I believe they have stuff about soda and other things too, so it should be really interesting. And the main organization that puts that together is the DNR. And so they'll also do other archaeology programs throughout the year, usually at the state parks, but you never know, so I'd definitely check out their website. They do lots of cool stuff. I would also check out the Central Indiana branch of the Archaeology Institute of America. The local group puts on lectures usually a couple times a year, and most of those lectures are open to the public. I'm not sure right now with COVID going on if they've done anything recently, but definitely a couple of years ago when I was in school, we'd go to 1 or 2 of these lectures a year when Purdue hosted them, and they're usually very fascinating. So I would check their website out if you're looking for lectures and things to go to in person. And with that said, similarly, I would keep an eye out for lectures at nearby universities. So we're in a great spot here in Crawfordsville. We're in between, Purdue, IU's nearby, we've got the Indy schools nearby. So there's always great opportunities to go to lectures, and a good way to find those is to follow the department's social media. So the Anthropology and Classical Studies departments usually will have a Twitter or Facebook page where they'll post about events. And maybe not right now with COVID, but usually their events are very open to the public, and they love when the public comes out and listens to what they say about archaeology. So I highly recommend keeping those on your radar, especially in the next year or two. So lastly, if you're really passionate about this, you love archaeology, you think it's super cool, you want to do it, you can take part in a field school. And this is where you go to an actual archaeology site and they teach you how to excavate, and you take part in the excavation. And while a lot of field schools are focused primarily on archaeology students, there are also many who are willing and eager to take on anyone who has a passion for archaeology. So these 2 pictures over here on the right are from my field school that I did in Ireland. And while most of us were probably archaeology students, we had quite a few people who weren't. We had a retired chemistry professor, we had a middle school teacher who wanted to teach your class about this stuff. We had all kinds of people who weren't archaeology students and who were just passionate about this, and they just did the work right along with us, so it was great. Sometimes field schools can be rather expensive. You're usually paying for room and board, plus part of the money from each student usually goes to helping fund the excavation. But there are affordable options that you can look out for. I've even seen a couple of free ones where if you're willing to provide your own accommodations, your own room and board, they will teach you at their site for free. So if that's something that interests you, this is the website here for the Archaeology Institute of America's list of programs. Usually the best time to apply and look for them is December through March. Usually they start closing their applications around February or March, so don't leave it too late. I may or may not have done that a couple times, but keep an eye on that. Unfortunately, COVID is always an issue, so right now some of the more open ones aren't happening. It's a lot of the smaller student-specific ones that are still happening to make sure that the next group of archaeologists becomes trained, but just keep an eye out there. And if this is something you're interested in, you're more than welcome to email me, and I can talk with you about what this actually entails, because it's a really cool experience, and anyone who's super passionate about archaeology should look into it. Alrighty, I am going to pull up all of your questions if I can. Let's see if I can find the questions. And while I'm doing that, I'm gonna put up my contact information if you want to write that down. And then these are the two main sources that I used other than kind of my own knowledge. They're both great information about American archaeology. Let me get to the comments. Looks like Jessica is talking about, up north you get the seasonal sand. Yep, I'm assuming you're talking about Lake Michigan. Absolutely, with the sand moving up there. So you can see how stuff, they always talk about trees and things getting buried, how quickly something becomes buried and rots away, and then you have to bring in the archaeologist to figure it out. Jessica, also a fan of Time Team, love it. What's the difference in time between grave robbing and archaeology? That is a very good question, and there honestly isn't an answer. A lot of times it depends on the community you're working with. There's people who do World War II archaeology, and a lot of those people's families are still alive, but generally you're looking for the body of lost soldiers, so it's something that the families of those people actively want you to be doing. They want you to be finding those bodies and figuring out who they are and bringing them home. So that's smiled upon. I know there's an example of, I believe it's a church in England where it was the 1800s. It was people from the 1800s that they're digging up, which is probably right on the line where most people would think of the difference between grave robbing and archaeology, but they went to all of the local families and all the people who were part of that church and said, hey, we want to do this project, we want to get your approval to do this. And they got that approval. So it's kind of, it's also intent, because grave robbing, you're just going in and taking people's stuff and taking it home with you. And with archaeology, you're generally looking for information. You have a goal. You're saying, I want to find out, what diseases inflicted the people in this community in England in the 1800s. Like, there's a very specific research. You're not just doing it to find something to put in a museum. That's definitely one of the biggest issues with the way people see archaeology. They think we just want something for museums. And in fact, it's kind of the opposite issue. In a lot of cases, museums actually don't have the space for all the things that archaeologists are bringing in, because you have to store every arrow point and every single little rock that has some possible meaning. You have to store all of that. So colleges and museums are actually running out of space. But yeah, absolutely, it is a fine line. It's mainly about intent, but also working with that local community, because archaeology does have a terrible track record, 100 years ago, of just walking into a community, taking all their stuff and walking away, especially places like Greece and Rome, and all that stuff is in the British Museum now. So definitely today we're very, very careful about our intent and what we do and whose permission and who we talk to. Alrighty, I think that is the only question I'm seeing. Thank you, Jessica. I know a couple of people who wanted to come couldn't make it because of, or got lost with all of our issues in the beginning with technology, but thank you guys all for coming. And if you ever think of any more questions, you're always welcome to email me at that email address, or come and check us out at the library if you want to get some of those books, and stop by the reference desk. I'm there most days of the week to answer questions, and I'm always there to talk about archaeology. So, all right, I think that is going to be it. Thank you all for coming.